I am Thomas Kidd. I'm a professor in the history department, and I'm also senior fellow at the Institute for Studies of Religion, which is putting on this lecture this afternoon. If you don't already know, the Institute for Studies of Religion is an interdisciplinary institute on campus that focuses on the study of religion across the disciplines, and we really are interdisciplinary. We have people who work on religion and health, religion and philosophy, sociology, and politics and history. And today's lecture is focused more on the history side, and so this is part of our program on historical studies of religion, which I co-direct with Professor Philip Jenkins, who's here today. I'm happy to introduce our lecturer, a longtime friend of mine, Professor Darren Dochuk. He is Associate Professor in Humanities at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Dochuk earned his BA from Simon Fraser University and his MA from Queen's University in Canada before completing his PhD in 2005 at the University of Notre Dame. And before joining the faculty at Washington University last year, he taught at Purdue University in Indiana. And in 2011, Professor Dochuk published From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Politics, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism, which came out from Norton. And we have copies of this book on sale out in the lobby from the Baylor bookstore. And this book has garnered a number of awards, including from the Society of American Historians, their Alan Nevins Prize, the American Historical Association's John Dunning Book Prize for outstanding historical writing on any subject in U.S. history, and the Organization of American Historians Ellis Hawley Prize for Best Book on Post-Civil War U.S. Political History. From Bible Belt to Sun Belt has also been reviewed in many publications, including in popular magazines such as The Nation, The New Republic, and Time magazine. Dochuk has also co-edited a collection of essays called Sun Belt Rising, The Politics of Space, Place, and Region from the University of Pennsylvania Press. In 2007 and 2008, he served as a research postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion at Princeton University, and he has been awarded a similar fellowship at SMU's Clements Center for Southwest Studies for the spring of 2013, which brought him into our neck of the woods. And as soon as I heard this, I asked him when he was going to lecture here. Professor Dochuk is currently working on a book project tentatively titled, he has great titles, gift for titles he has. This one is tentatively called Anointed with Oil, God and Black Gold in Modern America. And his lecture today, also an excellent title, is There Will Be Oil, A Sacred History of Pipeline Politics in Cold War America. Would you join me in welcoming Darren Dochuk?
Thank you, Professor Kidd. Thank you, Francis and Leon and ISR for the invitation and for coordinating this. I was here a couple years ago talking about From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, and as usual, enjoyed my time. I've also spent considerable time doing research here, right in the Texas collection. Go figure, Baylor has something to say about oil and religion. And I'm going to touch on a bit of that today, and certainly would be happy to expand in conversation. Let me say from the outset that this is, as Professor Kidd has mentioned, a book in process. And here I am in Texas and spending some good time in Dallas, but also traveling around the state from east to west to south, and all the different oil patches that this state has produced over the last century. And so this is in flux, and I am welcoming the opportunity to present little snippets of the larger book project, which I will outline for you in just a few minutes. And then also get feedback, and as I've said, some pushback as well. And considering that we are in the heart of this story, I certainly would welcome any feedback that you can offer me. How many of you have seen There Will Be Blood? The movie? Okay, is this ancient history by now? I don't know. But if you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. What is it? The Master, I think, is the latest from Anderson. So My title is obviously a play on that. There will be oil. And I'd like to take some time again this afternoon to do a few things. First of all, I'm just going to, in very concise fashion, text-based, just give you a sense of the larger project. The book spans really the history of oil, starting in the 1850s, or the history of oil extraction in the United States, at least, in the 1850s to the present day. Then I will zero in on one particular moment in that history having to do with really the early Cold War period between the 1940s and the mid-1960s, with the 1950s being the heart of that. And finally, really use a particular story to kind of open up this larger theme and some of the larger arguments that I'm making. Again, as the book title hopefully tells you, Anointed with Oil, God in Black Gold, this is really a study of the long relationship of Protestantism and petroleum in this country, looking also within a broader global context. The focus, at least at this early juncture, or this mid-range of research and writing, is on evangelical Protestantism, seeing as that tends to be the most dominant kind of religious expression on the oil patches of this continent. Is a part of a moving frontier, and so my focus has been on evangelical Protestantism. So why did this tight bond between evangelical Protestantism and wildcat oil form, and how has this bond been sustained? These are the questions, the big questions that frame my discussion, which again also frames the chronology which moves from the Civil War to the present. Let me give you just a sense here in a few minutes of what the larger argument is, and again, this hopefully will give you a chance to think up some questions and perhaps angles that I can consider in the future. I argue in the book that oil patch evangelicals have always considered petroleum their special providence, a fragile gift bestowed by God to be used industriously for the advance of his kingdom. Driven by sacred notions of stewardship and dominion and their rule of capture, which legitimizes their access to land, resources, and markets in the same way they approach God, on individual terms, they have long found a natural ally in the petroleum business, which has grafted these ideals onto an ideology of high-risk, high-reward, wildcat entrepreneurialism. This marriage has spawned structures of power with sweeping impact. While finances accrued through oil have helped clergy build successful ministries, evangelical businessmen and politicians have used their religious commitments to expand American oil's interests abroad and lobby for oil-friendly policies at home. As one unit, working together in philanthropic foundations, interdenominational associations, and parachurch organizations, these leaders have raised up generations of citizens committed to the quest for crude. Now, that's kind of the top-down story, but there's also a bottom-up dimension to this. Indeed, petroleum's allure, though, has not simply trickled down from above. Countless average oil patch denizens have banked their existence on the realities of this resource as well. While as roustabouts, floor hands, and roughnecks, they have applied their Protestant work ethic to the grubbiest tasks of drilling, as engineers, chemists, and geologists, they have used the same technocratic logic that informs their biblical exegesis to advance the sciences of extraction. Meanwhile, as pipeline walkers, offshore riggers, refinery journeymen, many of them have defined their service to the oil industry as tantamount to their service for God. Now, to be sure, this top-down and bottom-up story of Protestantism and petroleum and the sense of custodial care that comes within oil patch evangelicalism has produced as much angst as hope. In the boom-bust cycles of oil, Christian citizens have often been reminded that oil's anointing comes with a heavy cost. Indeed, tribulation has always plagued oil patch parishioners. In the 1860s, Pennsylvania, it came in the form of conflagrations that burned family businesses to the ground. In turn-of-the-century California, as cycles of rage between obstinate wildcatters and outnumbered law enforcers. While in the 1970s, it came in the guises of an energy crisis and war in the Middle East, which appeared to thrust America to the brink of apocalypse. In 2010, reminders that oil could be hellacious arrived in the Gulf of Mexico via British Petroleum's Deepwater Horizon. And to be sure, this sense of custodial care has generated as much hand-wringing as praise and a hermeneutics of damnation. Amid calamity, oil patch Christianity has indeed been forced repeatedly to confront petroleum's dissenters, whose voices get louder at each disastrous turn. Over time, the names of the outspoken muckrakers have changed, but the message has stayed the same. America's codependency on God and black gold is too heavy a burden, economic, political, and spiritual, to bear. Nevertheless, oil patch Protestants generally have stayed true to the dictates of their faith in a God who prospers them with black gold, and true to the political agenda this theology entails. Whether praying for oil's bounty or for deliverance from its extremes, whether working to maximize oil's proliferation or to rein it in, they have viewed their place in this sector as special and ruled Petrolia with a resolve that is as strong today as it was over a century ago. So that's the big picture, and I do not have time, of course, to trace this long history for you, or I might add, and here are the qualifiers, to do justice to the nuances that such blanket statements as the one I've just made have glanced over. To be sure, there are many gradations of experience, commitment, and outcome which once factored in test and dismantle clear binaries or neat categories in my story. Those, for instance, separating evangelical from non-evangelical. And admittedly, the story gets increasingly unwieldy as we move across time from the primitive oil industry of the late 1800s to the petroleum superstructure of the 1990s. And once we move across national borders and across lines drawn by race, gender, and citizenship. And I might also add, it is too easy. Oil has its own literature, really, a whole subdiscipline. And it is very easy to fall into some of the dominant narratives of this literature, the trap, really, of yellow journalism, where the ready-made anecdotes of big oil and big religion running amok have been assembled into some grand conspiracy of global domination. So I am aware of those and would be happy to flesh some of those out. But even if we cannot discuss these tensions in detail, I think they do animate my narrative, which I might emphasize seeks to measure compatibility, not conspiracy, of interest between Protestantism and petroleum. That's the big picture. What I would like to do now for the remaining time is walk you through kind of the story of one important moment in the history of evangelical Protestantism and petroleum, and by doing so make a connection between a province and a state that I'm very familiar with, Alberta, where I grew up, Alberta, Canada, and Texas, of good old US of A. And I hope that these connections will resonate with you perhaps on a very personal level, but certainly in terms of our context here. The chapter itself is, again, that which unfolds in the 1850s, and it is a chapter that has current meaning. We've heard a lot recently, of course, of the Keystone XL pipeline, and we will sure to hear more of this in the coming months as this issue continues to be grappled with at the highest elevations of political power. We have seen protesters, even just a few months ago, protesting the continuation of this pipeline that is going to bring oil from Alberta down to Texas, very concretely linking these two oil patches. What warrants attention in our moment here, I think, and in this heated political moment in general, is a revisiting of the past that created it, which requires, I think, a micro view, a glance back to the forces that created the oil sands in Alberta, that oil that is now going to be channeled through this pipeline to Texas, and then also to step back with the macro view. The moment is really the immediate post-war period. World War II ends, and in between 45 and 50, we see really a key moment in both the history of evangelicalism and in the history of U.S. oil. Perhaps you're familiar with the religious history, and in which case we see evangelicalism emerging from World War II, eager and ready, and most importantly, equipped to escape the margins, to escape the shadows of scopes, which has lingered since the 1920s. Coming out of the trials of the 1920s and 1930s, we are going to see a new evangelicalism emerged, illustrated, symbolized by the rise of Billy Graham, for instance, the National Association of Evangelicals. This early juncture between the late 40s and early 60s is going to be a critical period in that emergence, in that drama. Secondly, this is also an important moment in the history of oil. U.S. oil enters a pivotal period in the early Cold War period. If you'll recall, perhaps, U.S. oil had a rough time in the 1920s and 30s, too. The Teapot Dome scandal of the 1920s, the East Texas boom of the 1930s sends the industry into a frenzy with very little regulation, overproduction. The bottom drops out on pricing, coupled with really a bad image in the imagination of Americans. Here is America's worst excesses on display. And for the average American trying to struggle through the Depression, this obviously does not sit well. So oil, too, needs to be revitalized. Most importantly, the independent oilman needs to regain a foothold in the industry. Independent oil is going to emerge in the post-World War II period, struggling for its existence. As American oil during war and after decides to, and in very deliberate fashion, goes international, opening up new fields in Saudi Arabia, we see the major oil companies, 7 major oil companies, aligning themselves more closely with the federal government and through their own enjoyment of economy of scale and their integrated abilities to dictate pricing, to dictate production and extraction, hold a great advantage to the internationalization of U.S. oil, squeezing out the U.S. independent oilmen, the mid-majors and the independent oil companies that are really at home in the Southwest. They too need to find redemption. They too need to find some avenue. No surprise, independent oil and evangelicalism, therefore, in this period is going to team up together to really create a new cultural and political front. But the story itself can be drawn from the Keystone Pipeline, and this requires us to go back to, I think, the hidden history of the Canadian oil sands, the religious history of the Canadian oil sands project. You see a picture here of the Canadian oil sands, the Athabasca oil sands just north of Edmonton, Alberta. And as you can see, this is a vast landscape, some 54,000 square miles of muskeg and peat bogs, underneath which is oil ready to be extracted through very complex fashion out of the tar sands or the oil sands. This is a sprawling landscape, the largest of its kind in the world. The history of independent oil and evangelicalism in the 50s is very much tied to this reality. We also need to be familiar, I think, with the 4 architects of the Canadian oil sands project. Those who looked at this vast landscape in the 1950s and thought that it could be managed for profit on, again, a global scale, really, of impact. And it's going to be 4 people in particular who are going to take a leading role in that. All 4 of them are evangelicals. All 4 really represent different sectors of this marriage between evangelicalism and oil, proving that it is in itself an integrated multinational endeavor. Let me talk about these 4 architects, and perhaps you'll be familiar with a few of them. First and foremost is J. Howard Pugh. If we want to figure out the origins of the Keystone Pipeline politics of today, let's look back to the efforts of J. Howard Pugh. How many of you have heard of J. Howard Pugh? Okay. And certainly in the literature, at least, we're seeing a lot more written about business and religion, business and conservative religion. And J. Howard Pugh is emerging quite strikingly as a key conservative business leader based in Philadelphia, who is going to lead some of the most important anti-New Deal liberal initiatives in the post-war period. Now, what's striking is, and I think what's lost in this literature, is the fact that J. Howard Pugh is first and foremost an oilman. He's an independent oilman running a mid-major company, Sunoco, or Sun Oil at the time, known at the time. And it was really J. Howard Pugh and the Pugh family that envisioned the potential of the great Canadian oil sands way back in the 1950s. Now, granted, the oil sands in Alberta had been discovered much earlier. In fact, it was known that Native Americans had traveled through the area and been aware of this resource. In the 1920s, experts started testing to see if it could be extracted and refined, but all at great cost. By 1950s, therefore, very little has been done because it is too costly. The government itself cannot expend the energy or resources to tap into this. What is needed, therefore, is corporate assistance. And Alberta looks to J. Howard Pugh and Sun Oil in the early 1950s for that assistance. Sunoco is going to come on board, and with Pugh heading the show, is going to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in this project. In fact, it is going to be the largest private investment of its kind in Canada up to this point in history. Now, this is a great risk for J. Howard Pugh and Sunoco, but it's not so out of keeping or out of character, really, of J. Howard Pugh himself. Pugh is the latest in a generation of Pughs to be invested in the family business, Sun Oil. This goes back really to the 1860s and 1870s. The Pugh family is a product of the western Pennsylvania oil frontier, that first generation to tap into this new exciting resource. They are very devout conservative Presbyterians, fiercely laissez-faire in their economics, and they see oil, again, in very much custodial terms as theirs for really to create profit, but also to create a better community, a better church, and a better society. They are fiercely independent from the very beginning, and they are going to be going head-to-head with Rockefeller and the Standard Oil monopoly throughout the late 19th century. Pugh's father will start Sun Oil, and this will be his test. That will be one that he is forced to endure throughout his career. And in fact, he will push Pugh to the margins, push Sun Oil to the margins, just as Rockefeller will push so many other independent oilmen to the margins, like Lyman and Milton Stewart, who run Union Oil in California. Pugh, therefore, J. Howard, comes out of this family tradition eager to champion the independent cause on behalf of his father's business, on behalf of his father's evangelical faith. He becomes president of Sun Oil in 1912, will carry that label right through to the mid-1940s. Under his rule, under his guidance, Sun Oil will grow by 40 times. It will become, again, a very substantial and successful mid-major by the mid-20th century. He will retire in 1947 as CEO, but he will maintain head of the board of directors, and in some ways give him more flexibility to maintain power over the next 20 years and to really pursue, again, some of his ambitions for Sun Oil. Sun Oil, I might add, is Eastern-based in Philadelphia, but its big breakthrough comes in early 1900 and 1901 with Spindletop discovery in Beaumont, Texas. From that point forward, even though it's Philadelphia-based, the Pugh Sun Oil Company, Sunoco, will always consider itself Southwestern-based. This will be, again, they will feel very comfortable in the Southwestern base of independent mid-major oil, leading his connections to Texas in very concrete ways. Briefly then, Pugh is going to fund the Great Canadian Oil Sands. He sees this as part of this larger mission, which is combining business with religion, with politics in seamless ways. Coming out of World War II, he is determined to fight the New Deal state, which has created a comfort zone for major oil, which has created a strong federal government that is too earnest in his estimation to regulate independent oil, to regulate the oil patch. He is also going to build a philanthropic organization, the Pugh Foundation, which is really going to be, in his mind, the way to fight the Rockefellers, to fight liberal Protestantism, and to help kind of roll back liberalism within his own church. And it's in this frame that he is going to fund Billy Graham's ministry, Christianity Today, and just a host of other activities. The second architect will be the politician. And that is Ernest Manning. Perhaps you have, I assume you haven't heard of Ernest Manning, the former premier of Alberta between the late 40s and the late 1960s. Of course, Pugh is needing to work with government in a partnership, and he's going to find a like-minded evangelical Protestant in the highest office in Alberta, and they will work together through the 1950s to envision the Great Canadian Oil Sands Project. Who is Manning? Manning is a product of Alberta populism of the early 20th century, and we're familiar with populism in this country. Let me say that Manning represented the Social Credit Party of Western Canada in the early 20th century, and this would in fact be the most successful, enduring form of populist governance in North American history. He was tutored by William Aberhart, who you see pictured in the top left here. Aberhart was a charismatic preacher as well as a politician in the 1930s. He preached on his radio station on Sundays and then during the week ran the province. Aberhart also started the Calgary Prophetic Bible Institute in Calgary, pictured here. This was the leading training site for premillennialism, for prophetic teachings, and it was linked very concretely to the agenda of the Social Credit Party, which was populist, demanding local control, great community support, congregational support, anti-centralization, whether it's in the church or in governance, local autonomy, family values, community values. And this is what Manning grew up in, was tutored by Aberhart. Manning became Premier of Alberta when Aberhart died in the mid-1940s. Manning, pictured at his desk here, again, would take on the task of mainstreaming this populism, mainstreaming Alberta's unique governance throughout the 1940s and 50s. Manning, also a devout premillennialist evangelical, would also bring with him a certain prophetic outlook with him into the premiership. And that too would infuse his politics and inform him. And as would a more general conservative Protestant value system that stressed families, as you see pictured here, the Manning family. One of these, I believe the oldest son here, would actually go on to be an even more powerful politician in Canada in the 1980s and 1990s. This then is a marriage really ready to be made. And in the 1950s, Manning and Pugh began to correspond and began to forge kind of an identity and a relationship beyond the Great Canadian Oil Sands Project, which would ultimately be vital to the success of this oil sands project in the 1960s. They would write regularly, comparing notes on Calvin, on Presbyterianism, and also on petroleum. The realms fused into one another, and again, was difficult to separate. And this was partly also their ambition for the new evangelicalism. Manning, from the beginning, was on board Billy Graham's new evangelicalism and was in fact a key member of many different organizations wrapped up in advancing the new evangelical movement of the post-war period. Manning was also familiar with Texas. As he becomes premier in the late 40s, Alberta enjoys an oil boom. In 1947, the Leduc fields are discovered, and this really shifts North American oil's focus for a moment to Alberta. Recognizing the potential of this wealth, Manning is determined to funnel it again into the right causes, and that includes his religious causes. He preaches on these successes to Texas oil associations on a regular basis, really moving north-south, building this kind of axis of influence and authority between Alberta and Texas. On his Texas trips, he'll preach on Sundays to some of the leading Baptist churches in the area, and then on the weekdays to some of the independent oil associations. Let me move quickly now into the third architect, and that's Billy Graham. In their relationship, of course, Manning and Pugh are quite close on their theology, but they differ in slight moments and slight points in their politics. Manning is a populist. Manning is wary not just of big government, but also of big business. Coming out of the 1930s, Alberta, again, is very entrenched in that populist mentality. And so it's going to take some time to massage this anti-corporate stand, especially where dealing with Pugh and the Sunoco project and the Great Oil Sands projects is concerned. Helping massage that relationship is Billy Graham, whose soft diplomacy is really going to bring these two individuals into closer association through the 1950s. Now, let me pause for a moment and talk about the 50s and Billy Graham's connection to independent oil. It's going to have a very direct impact, as I will show in a few moments, on the logistics of the Great Canadian Oil Sands Project and bringing these two power brokers together. But in a broader sense, Billy Graham's new evangelicalism and his own ministry is going to strike a new level of influence in the 1950s, in part because he also taps into a much larger cultural and political project of the independent oilmen based largely in Texas. We know Graham has his breakout in 1949 in Los Angeles, but it takes very little time for him to realize that Texas is always going to be fertile ground for his ministry. And in the early 50s is going to visit Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, and hold large crusades, of course. He's also going to pay homage of sorts, pay tribute to Texas in his first movie. Shortly after he begins kind of his national crusade in the late 40s, he starts a movie company based in Burbank, California, and decides as his first movie, produced in 1951, he's going to pay tribute to Texas. Mr. Texas is the name of this first movie, a very rather generic plot line, but it tells a story of a rancher turned oilman who loses his way amid new wealth and the abundance around him, loses his moral compass. This is a story that Graham thought would resonate with a large population in Texas, and indeed it did. He premiered this movie, for instance, in Fort Worth at a Fort Worth revival, and beforehand celebrated with Sid Richardson, pictured in the middle here, perhaps one of four of the most powerful independent oilmen in Texas at this point. Richardson, for what it's worth, celebrated Graham's accomplishment. Here was a movie, here was a story that was really his own, a rags to riches, sinner to saint story that was being celebrated on screen as a morality tale, as really a parable for America as a whole. America could in the 50s recapture its own value system, its own faith in pristine capitalism and pure Christianity if it was to look to the values and look to the energy of the independent oilmen. Sid Richardson applauded that and would become a close friend of Billy Graham for the next few years, supporting his causes and a number of institutions in Texas, such as Baylor and many others. But there's more to this, of course. The alliance of independent oil and wildcat religiosity in the 1950s that Billy Graham will be at the center of is a much more larger cultural endeavor as well. And again, I can offer some of the details of the strains facing independent oil in the 1950s, brought on by the globalization, brought on by the bad images and understanding of the independent oilmen at this time. So the project is indeed vast. One of the ways, though, that Billy Graham helped independent oil regain its footing was on the cultural front, and that was through popular media. I just mentioned Mr. Texas as Graham's first movie. Graham is going to produce a second movie, which I'll talk about in just a moment, which really takes on the subject of oil as a redemptive narrative for America, and use that really to launch, again, his multimedia endeavors on a much larger scale. The 1950s, we know, we see a country enamored, fascinated with Texas crude. Hollywood itself, the silver screen is full of movies. The most, of course, famous melodrama of this point is Giant, produced in 1956, starring Elizabeth Taylor, James Dean, Rock Hudson. And again, here is the quintessential oil melodrama of a wildcatter who makes it big, strikes it big, hits the gusher, and thereafter is changed, all for the worse. He loses his moral compass along the way. Greed, materialism, selfishness drive him from this point forward. Really, he is testament. James Dean is testament, testament to American abundance gone badly in the 1950s. And his story is going to be one embraced by Americans across the board. Jet Rink is a symbol, again, of oil's excesses at this period. Wanting to tap into the imaginative and the fascination of the independent oilmen and of the Jet Rinks of the world, the Sid Richardsons, Graham produces a second movie called Oil Town, USA, which is released, I believe, in 1953. Here is Jet Rink meeting the Lord and Savior, meeting salvation by way of the cross. And Oil Town, USA is a story about Lance Manning, a fictional character who, like Jet Rink, makes his way into independent oil. He has all the bravado, all the confidence of your Texas wildcatter. And like Jet Rink, he very quickly loses his way. He is incredibly successful, but his family is falling apart. His wife dies, and he has a falling out with his daughter, his only daughter. And it is a fight that is partly induced by alcohol and his own alcoholism. Again, this is someone who plays on a big scale in a major way, but has lost his soul in the process. The story then moves into a very dramatic point where Lance Manning's daughter is near Oil Town, USA, when it explodes, when it erupts. Using real footage of the Texas City crisis of the late 1940s, the film shows how a town is absolutely devastated by oil. Manning, knowing that his daughter is there, rushes to the scene and comes across his daughter, helping wounded people again recover. Here she is sacrificing herself, and this really kind of softens his attitude. And that is confirmed, that new attitude is confirmed at the revival that Billy Graham holds in Rice Stadium in Houston. And there he converts to Christianity, and thereafter promises really to use his oil wealth to redeem America by funding new evangelicalism, new evangelical causes, and by, again, reclaiming America's traditional values of yesteryear, which were really embodied in that first generation of independent wildcatters of Western Pennsylvania. This is the message. Now, let me just pause here also to explain the other character on screen here, and that is Earl Hankemer. We are in the Hankemer building. That name should ring a bell. He is really the Lance Manning of the behind-the-scenes story of Oil Town, USA. Sid Richardson, Clint Murkison, H.L. Hunt, Hugh Cullen, these are, of course, the big rich, the independent oilmen in the 50s who capture the imagination of Americans and who fund a number of conservative causes, including Billy Graham's ministry. But it's the mid-level independent oilmen like Earl Hankemer who are really going to play foundational roles. Hankemer, just to give you a brief glimpse at his life, very much part of the network that J. Howard Pugh, that Ernest Manning are helping build between oil patches and across national boundaries, really on an international level. Hankemer is an East Texas oilman turned Houston executive who by the early 50s is really central, a pivot in a number of evangelical ministries, including the Navigators. He is also a staunch supporter of Baylor and will support Baylor University with substantial funds, for instance, for the business school. Though unable to match the wealth of a Richardson, he really does match the expansive influence behind the scenes within new evangelical circles. And he sees as his cause in the 1950s twofold, again, to redeem independent oil, his peers, to bring them back to Christ, but secondly, with a much broader vision of showing what America can do in the global fight against communism, against big government, to reclaim these values that I have already mentioned. And he does so by sponsoring Billy Graham's ministry. He is chair of the Billy Graham Houston Revival in 1952. He will chair Graham's 1964 Houston Revival in the Astrodome as well. More importantly, he helps Oil Town, USA. It is his home, which will be the centerpiece of the film. Hankemer will allow Graham access to the Petroleum Club in Houston, a highly secretive organization. And it's in the Petroleum Club that Graham will deliver his most biting but most profound message of salvation to Houston's wildcatters. This is the type of support that Graham would receive from many different quarters, and Hankemer would go on again to celebrate the success of Oil Town, USA. Hankemer would also celebrate the success of bringing other independent oil men into the evangelical fold by way of funding. Shortly after Oil Town, USA is produced and released, Hankemer and Graham share celebration at Hugh Cullen's $100,000 donation to Baylor University. Again, this is independent oil and evangelicalism forging ties partly through funding. Secondly, and I can only, again, just glance over this, but the broader context of what we're talking about here in the 50s is also political. The cultural front has political meaning. It's about selling a message. It's about, again, reclaiming a certain value system for Americans. And it has concrete enemies in mind. That is a large federal government built up not just by FDR in the 1930s, but by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, who was the enemy, the ultimate enemy of the independent oilmen. If the independent oilmen and evangelicals of the oil patch feared the apocalypse in the 1930s, the Antichrist wasn't necessarily FDR, it was Harold Ickes. And this is who they go after in the 1950s in a very concerted form. And there are, again, a number of substantive examples of this. Most importantly is a controversy that unfolds in the late 40s, early 50s, and that's the Tidelands controversy. In the late 40s, the Truman administration claims federal jurisdiction of tideland oil just off the shores of Texas and Louisiana. It's believed that millions and millions of gallons of oil are held there and in need of extraction. This angers independent oilmen to the highest intensity, and in 1948, in fact, causes them to jump ship from the Democratic Party and look for alternatives. Some will find their way into Strom Thurmond's Dixiecrat Party, not necessarily or only out of racial animosity or fear of desegregation, but fear that federal government is once again encroaching on their oil patch. They demand state rights of oil, offshore oil, but are again repeatedly faced with a strong federal government and courts which reaffirm federal control in 1950. This leaves them looking for another alternative in 52, and that's Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower is going to sweep into Texas, pictured here before you, and really to crowds, unprecedented crowds in many of Texas's towns and cities, preach this gospel of states' rights, hands off our tideland oil, and the independent oilmen are going to support this. And much of the support is going to be channeled through churches, much of it through some of these alliances that I have just talked about, with Billy Graham very much at the center of them. This is a gospel that is going to resonate with Texas oil patch citizens, preachers from those preaching in Dallas's First Baptist Church, which really is the epicenter of this. This is where Graham has membership and is worshiping on a regular basis, perhaps with the Hunt family, with the Murchisons, but also in other churches like J. Frank Norris's in Fort Worth, Texas. Eisenhower, we know the rest of the story, is going to win, partly because of the support of this alliance. And that Sunbelt oil patch meet Bible Belt alliance really is, even though not formed concretely yet or permanently in the 50s, is going to usher in a new era, and that is Sunbelt Republican politics in the late 60s, early 70s. And again, we kind of know the rest of the story of that, and I'd be happy to give you some, again, further insights into that. But let's return now back to the micro, the story of the Great Canadian Oil Sands, very much wrapped up in this emerging global alliance of God and black gold for cultural, political, and for religious ambitions. It also is going to have business ambitions, and they are going to, again, be very tangible and real. And they are going to create one of the most amazing technological wonders in the early 1960s. The negotiations that take place behind the scenes between Manning and Pew are going to begin to pay off. By 1963, even as we see kind of this emerging oil patch politics informing Goldwater conservatism and Ronald Reagan, back in Alberta, we see the Great Canadian Oil Sands taking shape. Pew visits the Canadian Oil Sands, pictured here at its early formation in the early 60s, in 1963. And there he, again, forges a formal agreement with the Alberta government to fund this with hundreds of millions of dollars. This is a project that needs to be forwarded in advance now with new speed. There is a hang-up, however, and that occurs in 1964. Just as Pew and Sunoco are getting full cooperation from the Alberta government, they still have to go through the Premier's office. And the Premier, again, showing some of his populism of old, is still a little hesitant to sell out Alberta to an American business. And so he is demanding some concessions that have to do with American labor, or Alberta labor, with taxation, and with some of the profits from this relationship, demanding that the citizens of Alberta themselves share the profits. And this, as you can imagine, doesn't sit well with J. Howard Pew or Sun Oil. And so there is a snag in the relations. Enter Billy Graham. Billy Graham decides that he is going to help out here. The three of them fly to Jasper, Alberta. Anyone been to Jasper, Alberta? Great skiing, great golf in the summer, and that's in fact what they do. J. Howard Pew shoots 82, his age, which is a huge accomplishment. I don't know if anyone has shot their age here, and he actually writes about it in his correspondents, incredibly excited about this. But more importantly, through their talks about theology and tar sands, they reach an agreement, which at that very moment is critical to, again, easing the tension between an American corporation and the Alberta government. And this soft diplomacy, in fact, works. In 1964, this is formally begun. Building by 1967, the Great Canadian Oil Sands will be fully operational, again, marking a historic turn in the history of oil, global oil. Now, there's a fourth architect. I've talked about three who really are critical. There's a fourth, and I've talked about him before when I've spoken at Baylor, so I will not kind of belabor the point here. But you need equipment, and you need very unique, large equipment to manage the oil sands. The only individual, really, or one of the only individuals in the world who can manage that is R.G. Letourneau, a Texas-based industrialist based in Longview, Texas, on the moves to East Texas in the wake of the East Texas oil boom, fine knowing that there is going to be a business for his equipment. And while he's building a business of large extractive industrial equipment, he also decides to make his way into oil more explicitly. Pictured in the top left here is the Scorpion. It's one of the first movable offshore oil rigs of its kind, built in the mid-1950s by Letourneau's corporation. It's built for Zapata Oil, run by George H.W. Bush, pictured at the christening here with George W. below. And Letourneau was also going to be instrumental, every bit as instrumental as Earl Hancomer, in bringing Billy Graham to Texas, hosting the Houston revivals. And this is, again, someone who is absolutely devout in channeling his profits. In fact, in his own life, 90% of his own personal profits back into his ministry, which is global, to Peru, to Liberia, and around the world, not coincidentally funneled to mission bases that butt up against new oil patches in these countries as well. Now, for our story, the purpose here is his ability to bridge, again, the Texas, Alberta, Canada, United States kind of boundaries. He is from a Canadian family. He's familiar with Canadian politics. His company, in fact, has a number of large land-moving contracts with provincial governments in Canada, so it's nothing new for him to align with the Canadian Oil Sands project. And his company, even after he passes from the scene, will be responsible for some of the first wave of large graders and tractors and dump trucks that will, again, really be unprecedented in their size for extracting. That then those are the four architects. And by 1967, the Canadian Oil Sands project opens to great celebration. And at that point, Letourneau, I think, had quite literally stamped his presence on Alberta's bleakest but richest terrain. But so too had Letourneau's three evangelical allies. Through their executive leadership, evangelical ecumenism, and political power, J. Howard Pugh, Billy Graham, Ernest Manning had shaped a world enterprise from beginning to end. By 1967, the Canadian Oil Sands' $235 million investment had facilitated a 3-year building operation involving a multitude of workers from around the world, all wanting to extract the world's largest single energy resource. Is it any wonder that the Canadian Oil Sands opening ceremonies in '67 pulsated to a Protestant beat? While at its grand opening, celebration prayers were offered to the Almighty God in thanks of this blessing. In its promotional literature, Sun proclaimed that this venture, quote, combines drama, man against nature, daring, the risk of large financial resources, and technological wonder. It is, quote, a pioneering undertaking in more than one respect. Letourneau couldn't have said it any better to his students in Longview, at his training institute in Longview, nor Pugh to his employees in Philadelphia, or Manning to his voters in Calgary, or Graham to his parishioners worldwide. Now, to be sure, the Great Canadian Oil Sands evangelical assurance would eventually falter, and I'm going to cut this part short, but we certainly have a more troubled history of the oil sands moving into the 1970s. Within its 3rd year of operation, the oil sands is already suffering from a lack of finances. This is an incredibly costly endeavor that always needs a new injection of money. And Pugh and Sun Oil are running out. and look for more government support. They also, again, continue to decry some of the concessions that are made to the Alberta people and want some of those concessions softened. Fortunately, Manning passes his leadership to Harry Strom, who is also a very devout evangelical premier. In fact, one of Strom's first activities as premier of Alberta is to go to Washington, D.C. to attend Richard Nixon's presidential prayer breakfast. And Strom will allow some of these concessions to be rolled back, to soften them, allowing Sunoil, at least for a moment, to reduce its payment of royalties to Alberta citizens. But still, even with Strom's aid, the oil sands project would limp forward, suffering from its inability to counter rising production costs and charges from environmentalists that the tar sands project caused ecological disaster. By the 1980s, Canadian oil sands would give way to government ownership, and with the added stability would come added success. Today, again, the controversy swirling around the pipeline is very much wrapped up in the status of the Canadian oil sands. And today the project is more viable than ever, promising a daily output of 3 million barrels. Amid escalating conflict in several global oil patches, the promises of an abundant oil source inside North American boundaries is appealing to a U.S. government that craves stability and a Canadian one that craves income. The oil boom in North Dakota and other parts of the U.S., which is making this country a dominant producer again, may eventually render Alberta oil sand unnecessary. But for the moment, Canadian crude is central to America's economic future. But this future remains contested on other grounds. The Canadian government's heavy investment in the oil sands has been an ongoing worry among environmentalists, sparking protests against close state petroleum connections. And environmental concerns continue to animate discussion south of the border, so much so that President Obama has cited the destructive Canadian oil sands as reason for potentially withholding approval of this major intercontinental pipeline. Battles over the Keystone Pipeline will not necessarily determine the fate of the oil sands project. China awaits as a buyer, but the future of Alberta's oil sands remain murky. So too, I think, does the future of oil patch evangelicalism. Regardless of its conflicting legacy and contested future, Canadian oil sands should remind historians that the relationship between God and black gold has always remained, and will remain a vital force in modern America. Offered abundant power in places where the petroleum belt meet the Bible belt, evangelicals have used it to synchronize their theologies of personal salvation, individual initiative, stewardship, with the politics of entrepreneurialism, free markets, and easy access to land and its resources. With clear intent, they have shaped America's engagement with the world in the supposed secular age by finding creases of authority in the cascade of social, technological, economic, and political revolutions that now shape every aspect of life. Just where this cultural and political imperative turns next, again, is to be determined. Perhaps you'll have some insights. Current protests of the Keystone Pipeline has brought to light competing voices even within evangelicalism. Among those voices, displeasure with oil sands and planned pipelines has been sojourners, I believe pictured above you, protesting the oil sands project and the XL pipeline, young evangelicals who speak a new language of environmental activism, and those countless Pentecostal and Baptist parishes that now dot the space on North Dakota and Texas's drill sites are again articulating an age-old worry about the negative effects dependency on oil wealth can have on the morals of the community and the spiritual health of the church. Still, there are plenty of indications from recent political happenings and impending developments on America's oil's new frontiers that the fundamental interests of oil patch evangelicalism will endure. As a sentiment for protest and impressive institutional structure, it will continue to stir up revolt against an overbearing state, impress upon the nation the wishes of the wildcatter, and shape the way millions of young Christians think about energy and the environment and America's place in the world. There, amid seemingly all-consuming struggles to secure blessings for new pipelines and drill sites and support for the beleaguered independent oilmen, the political mantra to drill, baby, drill will continue to be voiced as a theological imperative. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's go ahead and have some Q&A, and if you could stand up and speak up when you ask your question, that would be great.
Yes. Hi, I'm Lydia Bean
Yes. Hi, good to see you.
Hi. I'm curious about bringing it up present in Alberta politics and the relationship for Canadian politics between evangelicals and oil wealth. I mean, I interviewed Preston Manning so long ago in the office of a Calgary oil company, and through that relationship is still going strong. So.
Right, great. Glad to share that interest in Canadian history and Alberta history. Preston Manning is Ernest Manning's son and would move into national politics and lead really a revolution of sorts in Canadian politics, taking votes out of the Conservative Party, moving into a more, again, grassroots, populist conservative movement, the Reform Party. And I think that's an indication really of again, a process of transformation within Alberta politics. One of those curiosities this side of the border is just what happened to Kansas. You know, what happened to that interwar populism, which had, again, a strong evangelical impulse behind it? What happens to the critique of capitalism and of the corporate enterprise after World War II? And that's in part what I was addressing in the first book. That question holds for Alberta too. And Ernest Manning begins that process. I think, again, it's a function of pragmatics as well as ideas and ideology. Some of the logistics of the social credit party are difficult to implement once that province continues to expand. The government is in need, again, of expansion itself. And again, the economic logistics become much more complex. He becomes also, I think, able to transition Eberhardt's social credit, which is much more firmly grassroots populist, into a much more transnational kind of conservative, evangelical, and political ethos, which will ultimately be more business friendly. Now, again, there's going to be tensions throughout, and I think it's instructive to see that tension playing out even on a very personal level. And I think Ernest Manning remains very true to that. Nevertheless, the trend is similar, if behind the curve, to what goes on down here. And Strom and succeeding premiers of Alberta, I think, will see clearly the power of this economic resource, but also the need to, again, massage relationships with corporate America in an attempt to marshal that. And also, I think Preston Manning, too, will do that on a national stage. I know, in terms of the local church, I mean, what happens when almost overnight your church is enjoying the prosperity. We see this in 1930s East Texas, where the poorest white and black churches are literally drilling holes into their floors and striking oil beneath them, and all of a sudden reinterpreting their history in providential Old Testament terms. And that reinforces a certain notion of wealth and abundance that is hard to escape or to ignore. And that reality very quickly works its way into a political logic, right? And I think that, too, is what happens in Alberta. Following 1947, oil will always be at the center of Alberta's economy before even the oil sands. And the churches there rise and fall according to the rise and fall patterns of oil. But I am and as you hopefully get a sense of, this is an American-based story, but I'm hoping to go from local to national to transnational and ultimately to global. And I know that the 20th century is America's century. It's America's century in part because it's America Oil's century. But at the same time, we see many movements of people, of interests, of initiatives, missionaries, oil workers, oil hunters, going from the Netherlands to Indonesia, from Great Britain down to the Middle East. So this is, in many ways, a global story as well. I'm trying to keep it manageable, though.
Well, I hope you end up writing something about the sort of Canadian right oil Alberta business, because, I can count on my hand like 5 things that have been written about that, and none of them, I think, really speak satisfactorily to the role of these evangelical elites.
Right, good. And let me just add, too, I know you've had this top-down story today, but I really am stressing, too, the tensions this creates, even within the pew of the Baptist Pentecostal Church. I mean, I do think increasingly so today there is, again, an evaluation, and I'm hoping this, story ultimately creates further grounds for debate about some of these very pressing current issues. And I am curious to see where, again, this goes next, including among a younger generation. Hi, Philip.
Philip Jenkins. I lost an admiration of your talk and your work, and it just set off so many ideas, and I was raised two very quickly. One is, I know what your next book is clearly going to be. It's going to be on these evangelical networks and their universities, including Baylor Grove City in Pennsylvania, which is a Pew University, which is such a center for conservative activism in Pennsylvania. But there's one missing word. There's a famous book in England about the missing dimension, which is intelligence and statecraft. And if you look at these oil networks, they provide the framework for the new American intelligence world post-1945. And what you'll see is these people coming together through those intelligence networks in the US, in Canada, and in Australia. Not through oil there, but very, very parallel sort of worlds. But when people, as you said, when the US government, for instance, wants to do something in the Dutch East Indies, who are the people who are already working there? So obviously there's a very, very close marriage of oil and intelligence, which has never gone away.
Right. That's a great point. And again, this is sprawling. I'm having a hard time. Not a hard time. I'm enjoying it. But, you know, there also needs to be a certain centeredness to it. And, you know, by bringing Ernest Manning into this, I mean, I think there are four sectors there that I'm interested in exploring at the top level, right? And that is, it's the CEO, not just of Sun Oil, but also of Standard, also of Texaco, Humble Oil, and there's also the industrialists, there's also the preachers, but then there's the politicians, and that's where the statecraft hopefully will enter to some degree. And certainly as you look globally, I mean, I'm fascinated with the connections. And again, it's not necessarily linear, but, you know, just at the state level, for instance, we were talking about Neff earlier, President Neff of Baylor University, running the Texas Railroad Commission in the 1920s. I mean, this is someone who has a very invested, immediate concern with oil and policy. Federally, you know, how do people like Josephus Daniels, you know, Secretary of the American Navy, ambassador to Mexico during the nationalization of oil there, I mean, how do they negotiate and navigate this terrain? And without necessarily imposing some coherent evangelical Protestant view, but at least grappling with it. And then certainly as you look internationally at the way missions tracks and maps onto oil exploration, I think, again, not as some conspiracy, but as some compatibility here. And that working through formal channels of diplomacy and also of kind of boardroom politics. Yes? Oh, okay, right.
A ton of Masons, especially with Pews and the Presbyterians, and anyone they ever dealt with.
Interesting. Okay, sure. Good. Yes?
Following up a little bit on Philip's question, I'm Mike Parrish, History Department. I wonder if you have detected any kind of connection between big oil and the military. And, you know, I'm thinking about the end result for a very long time, the military being the biggest consumer, that is the U.S. military, the biggest consumer of petroleum products, and pressure from the military, military leaders, the Pentagon, Congress, to keep oil as widely and easily accessible as possible, and to keep oil and oil products, refined products of all kinds, as cheap as possible, in order for the military to be able to operate more efficiently around the world.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a great point, and that again adds to Phil's point of other ways to get at some of these questions of power and influence. And the easy answer to that is, again, that's one of the next steps, is to dig into some of these. But I can say, for instance, going back to the pews, Sun Oil receives, no surprise, but it receives a major boost during World War II through its contracts for aviation fuel with the military. And that, again, is indicative of a much broader phenomenon. Pew is also welcome to Washington to head up a commission for the Navy. In fact, who runs the Navy really has access, again, to these questions and to the capacities of American oil and its interests abroad. To what degree leaders like some that I've mentioned today are able to kind of impact those decision-making processes, I'm not sure about yet, but we'll hope to explore. So that's not a real satisfactory answer, but that is certainly on the radar. And again, in the first, my first book, and some of this is kind of bouncing off of that, is no doubt, that defense contracts kind of reimagine this region, right, that we know of, Texas to California, and by virtue of their presence, evangelical Protestants are really going to benefit institutionally from the growth of that by way of defense contracts, whether directly or indirectly, and oil, fuel, and so forth, and however much in terms of working with pricing and so forth is part of that equation. Yes?
Yeah, I was curious, just two questions of context, really. Are you just interested in the connection between oil and conservatism, or is that a unique connection? And since it wasn't oil and liberal Protestantism, as you mentioned, so I don't know if it was like you just highlighted the conservatives, or they were actually starring in this connection.
Right.
And secondly, were the people you're talking about and their allies in other industries, or again was oil unique?
Yeah, great questions. And I stressed conservatism because it's maybe, I don't want to say predictable, but it's familiar. And I'm certainly not writing a story of the Republican right. In fact, I'm doing my best to move away from that literature and that conversation, as important as it is. I'm interested in finding other creases of influence and connection between largely Protestant. We could ask about Catholics too, Catholicism and oil, but Protestant and the oil industry. So I stress conservatism, but what strikes me in this story, and again, when you're trying to look for these narrative threads and some of the tensions that move throughout, and that is very much between independent and major oil, and that begins in the 1870s, the Rockefellers. And so you could tell the story, as we know, of American Protestantism as a story of major versus independent oil. And so I will do that in some regard. And so spend time looking at, certainly that first generation of Rockefellers, John D. considering himself a good evangelical Baptist. And then John Jr. comes along and things begin to shift a bit. And really the crisis in American evangelical missions and American evangelical institutions of the early 20th century is in many ways exacerbated by that tension, that fight with the Rockefellers, who see the potential of combination of cooperation, both in oil and in religion, as a way to build a much more prosperous international vision for America. And that clashes with the rule of capture that the independents want to hold dear. And that, I think, again, filters through even the 20th century. 1964, the Goldwater Rockefeller campaign. This goes back to the old tensions between the first Pew and the first Rockefeller. And so it's more than just conservatism. It's also measuring that, and to some degree, as is possible, seeing how perhaps this relationship plays out in different ways on a more liberal Protestant side. What was the first question?
That was the first question. Second question, were there, talking about Western Pennsylvania, were there similar alliances in steel or?
Oh, great, yes. Well, so, right. And as we look at, I think scholars of religion have done wonders lately to kind of imagine the late 19th, early 20th century. And certainly engaging the secularization debate that's ongoing, and reimagining kind of industrial religion. That is, what is going on in the coal mines of the Appalachian region, where coal itself assumes a certain property that is not necessarily material or physical. It's also in some ways, imagined as sacred. This is a sign of modernity, of prosperity, of progress. So there are other sectors in which that same relationship plays out, but what strikes me about oil is just how powerful mythologically, materially, physically, that relationship, that potential is. I mean, we know the money that comes out of oil transcends anything else. And then we also know that oil itself has so many meanings, rooted in the Bible, rooted in Scripture, the anointing. I mean, there's ways in which I think your individual wildcatter imagines oil that they don't imagine coal. It's there for the taking if you can figure out how to get it out of the ground. Whether by magic, whether by prayer, it's there, at least initially. Whereas coal, you are digging yourself into the earth. It's gritty. Again, there's nothing mystical or magical. There's no manifest destiny necessarily about that. So, but maybe I'm over exaggerating that. Yes?
Does organized labor play any role in your story? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
in Canada, the Christian Labor Association of Canada is organizing the tar sands. But I mean, is there any corresponding role with the religion-oil relationship?
Well, oh boy. So all these answers are like, yes, I'm going to do that. Yes, then I'm going to do that. Of course. So, again, you're hearing the easy part of the story. That's following the money. That's the boring part. I'm interested in what it means to grow up in Beaumont in 1904 or in Tyler, Texas in 1935, where the pain and the tensions and the struggles that oil brings are also every bit as pronounced. And that includes in labor. Labor politics on the oil patch, I think, are some of the fiercest and deadliest. And I think it's because it clashes with this mythology of the wildcatter, the rule of capture, and that is the essence of kind of pristine capitalism. The individual has the rights to that. Don't you dare stop me, whether it's government or unions. And so there's a struggle, a tension going on there. And we've read it. We've had books about coal mining and labor, and those are incredibly rich. And so if I can perhaps add something to that, I will, and in terms of race as well. So last question? Yes?
Oh, you were already talking about the idea of rule of capture. Could you very briefly, you already mentioned it, the theological and the social ideological.
Sure. What strikes me, and again, I'm learning the language and the economics of oil. I am in some ways a religious cultural historian who's kind of making his way in, dabbling in the very complex economics and property rights of oil. And I'm sure some of you could tell me, could teach me a lot, and feel free to talk to me afterward. But, the rule of capture, what's striking, I think, about oil at its founding is its unique, again, property rights, which are distinctive here in the States as compared to elsewhere. And it really promotes this free-for-all, at least initially. An individual has the right at their speed, with their energy and their resources, to drill wherever they want to drill and to claim that oil, that subsurface mineral. And it creates you see these pictures of Spindletop or of Titusville, 200 derricks on 2 acres. I mean, this is what gets me about this story. Forget about the text base. The visual is something else. I mean, this is when I decided to do the story. You're just looking at these pictures. I can't imagine living in one of those environments where the steeples are literally, these derricks are towering over church steeples, but yet that's all part of this reality. So that's what you get, and it's waste, it's inefficient, and that will be curtailed through a number of efforts through corporate cooperation and government regulation. But that always tends to threaten the autonomy of the independent wildcatter, who, however wanting of some help and regulation over that inefficiency, that rule of capture, still wants to hold to the mythology, not the mythology, but to the essence of that, and to do everything they can to protect it from encroachment from external forces. And that obviously can be seen in other sectors of the economy and in politics more generally, but there's something about oil, I think, that is unique and very powerful. Thanks.
Well, this is terrific. Obviously, very interesting project, and we're going to look forward to this book. And don't forget, by the way, that there are copies of From Bible Belt to Sun Belt for sale out in the lobby. So join me in thanking Professor Dochuk again. Thank you.